Though salt-only lactofermentation is the easiest, most straightforward method of fermenting vegetables, there are a few options for adding a starter culture to speed the process up. There are several different options that you can use. The first one I'm going to talk about is whey. Beneficial bacteria and enzymes that happen whenever making cheeses and yogurts are in this, so they introduce something new to the culture than what was just on the vegetables. Other options for starter cultures include a little bit of juice from a previous fermenting batch. So if I went into my sauerkraut that I've been fermenting for a few weeks, pressed out a little bit of that brine, set it aside, that also would jumpstart the process because there's already beneficial bacteria that have been fermenting for several weeks on that previous vegetable. You can also use kombucha, water kefir. There are even starter cultures that you can purchase online from different websites where they have a packet of powdered starter culture that you can add to a vegetable ferment. Let's talk a little bit about why you would even do this. So if you live in a really cold climate and it's in the middle of winter and you're having trouble with your ferments taking off, it might be a good idea to add a starter culture. In the middle of summer, if your house is warm, probably not the best idea because this will speed things up and your vegetables could become mushy. Remember earlier when we talked about the speed at which vegetables ferment actually predicts how long they're going to keep once they go in the refrigerator. So a faster fermentation can mean that it won't last as long. So if it's warm and you add the starter culture, you might end up with mushy vegetables that don't store very long. Not ideal. Some people prefer the taste of vegetables that have a starter culture, and some people prefer to use less salt than what's required for lactofermentation. Maybe for dietary reasons they need less salt. This could be the option for them. Now remember, salt hardens the pectins, so if you're using less salt, you may deal with mushy vegetables more quickly earlier on in the process. So you'll have to watch that. Today I'm going to be making lacto-fermented salsa with a whey starter culture. I don't allow my salsa to ferment as long as the other vegetables. They have a tendency to get mushy over time and too sour for my taste preferences. So that's why I like to use a starter culture for this. Again, it's good to start with not sanitized vegetables, overly washed and heated, but I am going to give them a quick rinse to get off any dirt, bugs, anything like that. Always best to start with the freshest that you can. Summer is a really great time to make this salsa. If you're like me, I have access to a lot of homegrown tomatoes from our garden, and then I can also get them from the farmer's market. They're just very readily available. This is a really great way to have fresh salsa for months. So you can ferment this and still be enjoying it in the middle of winter. I'm gonna start with 4 small tomatoes. I'm aiming for about 2 cups of diced tomatoes. If they're really juicy in the summer, I try to lift my cutting board often so that I can keep all of that really good juice. It works really well for the brine, so I don't have to add any extra liquid. If you're using like a Roma tomato that has a little bit less liquid, it may be necessary to add additional brine. I'm not going to have to here with these tomatoes. They're nice and juicy, plus the whey, plus the lime juice. It will be plenty to keep the vegetables submerged below the brine. All right, to this, I'm going to dice a bell pepper and half a white onion. You could also do red onion. Both are delicious. And if this is just for the adults, adding in a jalapeno tastes really great. A little spicy for the kiddos, especially if they are fresh jalapenos. We've gotten some super spicy ones out of our garden that kids couldn't handle. You can really do this with any salsa recipe. If you have maybe different vegetables in your garden that are ready or different herbs, I like to do the 4 small tomatoes as the base, and you can add in whatever. I just keep that in mind so that I know that the salt ratio is pretty good. So for 4 small tomatoes, 2 teaspoons of salt and 1/4 cup of a starter culture, like the way I have here, is what I aim for. So if you want to throw in any other vegetables but end up with about that same base of tomatoes, that's what I'd aim for. Red onion tastes delicious in salsa, but I almost always prefer white onion. Even with tacos, I like raw white onions on them. Just my preference, but any onion will do just fine. You could also throw a leek in. It's delicious as well. And a little fresh garlic always makes everything better. When I'm doing large quantities of garlic, I almost always use my garlic mincer, but I'm just gonna throw in a couple today, so I'll just use my knife. Chopping it nice and fine, but the flavors will meld together as it sits and ferments. That's one of the beautiful things about fermenting salsa. It's good when it's fresh, but it's even better when it's fermented. It really takes on a whole new depth of flavor that is so much better. A little sour, so tasty. And a little fresh cilantro, about 1/4 cup. I'm just gonna eyeball it here. You could of course use a measure if you really want to, but I love fresh cilantro. It's just not salsa without it. You'll notice that in a lot of these lessons and recipes, I'm doing things by taste, by smell, by eye. You get really used to that when cooking on the homestead and in traditional cooking and skills. There's something to be said for learning something in the beginning with the technical, the scientific, the measuring, but over time you'll get comfortable and you can do a lot of these things just by your senses. All right. Little fresh lime juice. This will enhance the flavor, but also will create more brine so that we don't have to add any additional water. Sometimes I leave the lime juice out in the middle of summer. The tomatoes are juicy enough, it is just fine. You don't want this salsa to be too liquidy because then you can't use it on a chip. Something like that's kind of tough. Though I will say, once it's fermented and all the liquid is out, you could take a fine mesh strainer and strain off a little bit of liquid. Throw that into some rice or any other recipe like a taco soup or something like that. Delicious, and then you still have your thick salsa that you're used to. All right, next I'm gonna add in my starter culture. So I have whey here, like I explained. I'm gonna do about 1/4 cup. Whatever good bacteria, yeast, enzymes that are in here will now be introduced to the lactic acid that's present on the vegetables. Lots of good bacteria going on in here. I'm also gonna still add salt. Remember that salt is what creates that nice texture. If I were to leave this out without any salt to ferment, I would be left with mushy tomatoes and peppers and onions. Not good. Just gonna give this a good stir, incorporate all of these beautiful ingredients. This is where a funnel comes in handy. I don't always use a funnel with fermenting, but salsa is my #1 reason for it. Smells so good already. Have you ever gone into the refrigerator, you've had salsa a while, that you weren't aiming to ferment, but it had bubbles and tasted a little bit like soda? That's what we're creating here, but on purpose, not by accident. It'll have some of that wonderful carbonation, but highlighting the tasty elements of all the ingredients in this salsa. This is another really good time to grab that cabbage stomper if you have one. Determined to fit this all in 1 quart jar. I think it's going to be perfect. Okay. Put it over my bowl while I top it with the weight because I'm probably going to lose a little bit of brine. But this weight will keep everything submerged. If you have a cabbage leaf or an onion peel, that's perfect also. Okay, it's actually the perfect amount. I'm gonna fish out just a little bit of the cilantro that came up. Not a big deal if you don't, but I do prefer to do that. And then I'm just gonna top it with my fermenting lid. We oftentimes will eat this right away. My family loves it, but this will keep in the refrigerator for several months. The flavors will continue to meld and change. It'll ferment slightly as it sits in there, but it will last and be a great way to have fresh salsa for many months. Now that I've shown you several ways to lacto-ferment vegetables, in the next lesson, I'm going to share how to actually incorporate these into your diet and get them into your kitchen regularly.